Okay. So welcome again for this new panel on the importance of culture as a cultural weapon for peace. So without much ado, I immediately give the word to Professor Luc Reychler, Emeritus Professor of International Relations of the University of Leuven in Belgium, former Director of the Research Center for Peace and Strategic Studies of Belgium. Professor Reychler has a reputation of a pioneer of thinking about durable peace architecture, how to build durable peace architecture to prevent the collapse of the current society into war. He will speak especially the way Erasmus would approach the crisis in Ukraine, and then during the questions and answers, we will try to have more questions for him. Professor Reychler.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Is it clear enough? Thanks for giving me some of your precious time and a beautiful auditorium to share an analysis of the current war in Ukraine, but especially to reflect on how Desiderius Erasmus would deal with it. So really the main question that I try to answer today is, what would Erasmus say about war and peace in Ukraine? As one of the greatest minds of the Renaissance, Erasmus highlighted the folly of religious wars. Folly is the pursuit of a policy that is against the interests of the people of the countries involved. And he took on the establishment of his time, being the princes and popes. Their excuses for going to war were criticized and satirized in writings such as In Praise of Folly or Complaint of Peace. In the midst of war, what is really courageous, he gave peace a voice. His comments of nearly 500 years ago are still relevant today because although wars are unique, are historically and culturally different, they are universally similar. Wars and counter-wars, I use the word counter-wars to refer to the war fought against the country that started the war. Wars and counter-wars purposefully commit atrocities. People, above all soldiers, are still slaughtered, pierced, burned, shredded, suffocated, tortured, pillaged, etc. And the violence committed during war is, as compared to violence in peacetime, is applauded and called righteous and patriotic. And the soldiers, dead or alive, get praised with medals. Erasmus warned us that wars are attractive for people who have no experience or knowledge of it. His disgust with war was well expressed in the citation, Dulce bellum inexpertis. War is sweet for the inexperienced. Now, before looking at the war through Erasmus' eyes, let me just focus on some facets of the war which have not been part of the official discourse in the West. I must say I've studied war since 50 years, so what I try to give is my analysis of the Ukrainian war. So if you add those facets that I will list, 8 facets, I think you get a much more balanced, comprehensive and impartial picture. First, the war was anticipated. Several diplomats and scholars, including myself, expected the war. For example, in 2008, during the George Bush presidency, William Burns, the American ambassador to Russia, who later served as director of the CIA, cautioned about that the expansion of NATO to Georgia and Ukraine would have deadly consequences. It would be the brightest of all red lines and create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So it was anticipated. Second, it could have been prevented. The West, especially America, made war prevention difficult by her expansionist foreign policy, especially in the 21st century. The reduction of the art of diplomacy to coercive diplomacy, and the regime change, and the underestimation of the risks and the costs of escalating a proxy war. Political realism was replaced by neoconservatism that urged democratic states to establish a new international order through military power, sanctions, and regime change. So it was anticipated, it was not prevented. Third, Russia started the war and is called the main culprit, but the West and Kiev is co-responsible. And there are several indicators of the co-responsibility. In 1990, Ukraine defended itself as a neutral country. The country would not become member of an alliance. NATO would not expand to Ukraine. Now, during the first 24 years of its existence, Ukraine did not experience war. But the American interference in domestic policy of Ukraine in the name of regime change was well underway before the Maidan revolution. This meddling in domestic affairs and NATO's stealthy expansion threatened Russia's objective and subjective security. Russia spoke of existential security. The US and NATO ignored the security issue, arguing that the alliance is peaceful and defensive. While this public confession is painfully dissonant with the many wars that America and their allies and NATO waged in the 21st century in the Middle East and Europe. I don't have to give the list: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, in Serbia to support in 1999 the Kosovo separatist movement. So the increasing political and geographical expansion of NATO to the Russian borders presented Russia with a crisis and a big dilemma: to allow this to happen or to stop the expansion in time and thus avoid a fait accompli. The fourth facet I would like to add to the analysis is there is not enough space for an open discussion, not only in Russia or Ukraine, but also in the West. And as you know, an impartial, open and critical discussion about prevention and co-responsibility would contribute to a sound analysis, forecast, and a more realistic and rational policy. It would significantly increase the chances of serious peace negotiations. In Russia, conversation about the war and the current and the 8 years of civil war in Ukraine that preceded it is impossible, it was very difficult. That's also the case in Ukraine. In public spaces of the free and democratic West, all the noses are expected to point in the same direction. An open and critical discussion is discouraged by what is called groupthink. This is a political psychological phenomenon that prioritizes agreement and discourages critical commentary and the discussion of alternatives. Characteristics of groupthink are, first of all, the illusion of infallibility, It means we are incapable of error. The conviction of one's own morality prevails. The rationalization of one's own decisions. The stereotyping and diabolizing of the opponent, and pressures and sanctions to enforce conformity. While this climate of groupthink undermines the chances of successful and cost-effective decision-making and forms a one-sided and narrowly informed public opinion. And besides, in wars, pacifists and peace researchers tend to be sidelined, sanctioned, stigmatized as traitors, dreamers, and psychological deviants. And also, if you look at the universities, the academics, they are quite silent. Because, there is still promotion, and you need funding for research, and it can be influenced by your position. Fifth facet that we should add is the war in Ukraine is a vicious entanglement of an internal and proxy war. There was an internal war. Of course, it was internationalized. So it's an escalation of an 8 years long civil war in a plurinational country. Fortunately, so far, it has remained a limited war, taking place within the borders of Ukraine. It has become a mega event. Diplomacy is down. President Zelensky became a stand-up diplomat and appears, now less than before, almost daily in conferences and the living room. Sixth point is the costs are high. During the war, it's difficult to find good statistics. It's unbelievable. It's about approximately 100,000, it's difficult to count because they are usually, the statistics are usually rude and not reliable. Because the numbers are part of psychological warfare. For example, not much attention is given to the casualties and the destruction during the preceding, of course, internationalized civil and secession war in the Donbass. I remember in 2018, the Washington Post reported, most of the fighting is done in the Donbass, that Donbass was one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. After 5 years of fighting, more than 10,000 people were killed and 2,800 of them civilians. The war destroyed, and this is the war before, the war that we are talking about, the infrastructure and a third of the hospitals, schools, homes, and election facilities. And the number of refugees and displaced citizens was very high. I will not talk about the current estimations of casualties and people who were killed. The problem before, however, are not only the huge costs. Normally, we do not only talk about the physical costs, the material costs, the economic costs, but also the social costs, political costs, psychological, spiritual, ecological, etc. But also the real and the expected benefits and profits. I would say, or at least I found out, that wars last as long as they are considered profitable by the main protagonists. Seventh, the war logic prevails. No serious efforts have been undertaken to boost the chances of de-escalation and the building of sustainable peace. Humanitarians and hawks in the West continue to ask for more guns and more wars. And the one-liner of Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, and I quote, "Weapons are the way to peace," is a fitting title for a surrealist painting of Magritte. 8, this is my last remark on the war, The war will probably end as a lose-lose operation. Violence may continue for a long time, intensify, and may even lead to regional and third world or nuclear war. The loss is not only for the Ukrainians and the fighters on both sides of the battlefield, mostly young men, of which 40 to 50% have no military experience on both sides. But also the whole of Europe. For some spectators in the rest of the world, the war is a European tragicomedy. Now, much more important is how would Erasmus respond to the wars in the 21st century, and especially this war? And I tried to cluster what I think would be his comments in 5 groups. First, he would criticize and satirize the excuses for ongoing wars. For example, the misrepresentation of the war as a defense of democracy and the democratic world. He would also tackle the propaganda on both sides. And above all, he would point at the stupidity of war and the hubris and mediocrity of the warmongers. Only wise people build sustainable peace. He would also remind us that the modern weapons, as compared to the weapons during the religious wars 500 years ago, and the smart weapons have not reduced the actual and potential atrocities of war. And the weapons of mass destruction are just around the corner, waiting around the corner. He would also name the princes and the popes of today, and the war profiteers who are responsible for the war. And as he said 500 years ago, he said what cannot be refuted by argument and fact can be, at least be parted by laughter. So this is the first comment. He would really focus on the stupidity of the war. The second remark would remind us of his observation that war is attractive for people who have no experience of war or are not directly experience the consequences of it. If you look at the war in Ukraine today, it looks more and more like a cage fight, a huge cage fight, in which the outsider supporters, and we are supporting one of the fighters, are safe spectators. If you are in the US, if you are in Belgium, you are in Italy, you are quite safe. Who weaponize the fighters and encourage them to win. So this is the second remark, that the war is easy or attractive for people who have no experience of it. What would be his third remark? The third remark is as a pacifist, he was a constructive pacifist. He also had concrete proposals for ending the war. He would insist that the war should be ceased for a cessation of the war. Because for him, peace is more precious than triumph. And the frozen conflict, less destructive, less costly, and less dangerous than a protracted war. The cessation of war would go hand in hand with the re-establishment of communication and peace negotiations, but also with development. And to convince his audience, assuming he knows the recent history in the world, at least in the 20th century, he would refer to the Korean War, which was a lose-lose war, but ended with a ceasefire. And one of the countries that, of course, negotiated South Korea, that negotiated the ceasefire, also decided to develop itself fast and use all its talents to become a prosperous country. So South Korea reminds us, he would say, that it is not who wins the war, but who wins the peace that determines their future. So a ceasefire in Ukraine, combined with efforts to win the peace, could probably be a formula to end the war. Fourth remark, I think it would make, refers to the relation between education and peace. He would insist that the European Erasmus program Plus, for education, training, youth and sports, gives more attention to the education of sustainable peace building and the prevention of war, and would invite both Ukrainians and Russians to participate in that program. Finally, this is the last thing, he would encourage us to take part, all of us, in sustainable peace building. This may sound like a dream, but as 500 years ago, he would remind us that there are some people who live in a dream world, that there are some who face reality, and then there are those who turn one into the other. I assume that most of us belong to the latter category, trying to turn one into the other. Let me just end by saying that Erasmus was for me a source of courage to speak out, because as an emeritus I thought, I've studied so many wars, why don't I just give up? But listening to Erasmus really was a big source of courage. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring words and emotions. So now I'm going to read to you the message sent to the conference of Liliana Gorini, who is the chairwoman of Movisol, the La Rouge movement in Italy, and who unfortunately for different reasons could not attend. So I will read her message to all of us and to the conference. So here's what she says. I'm very sorry that I could not attend the conference in person as I was hoping to. Many of you may remember me from the last conference in memory of Lyndon LaRouche in 2019, which I did attend because there was a car driving me to it. Some of you know me for the work I did with Helge and Lyndon LaRouche in 1988 on the first Verdi tuning conference in Milan, where I live. Unfortunately, in the last years, Rigoletto's maledizione seems to have hit me, and I am unable to travel for health reasons. Helge asked me to send a message to all of you, and I thought that given the present dramatic situation we all experience in Europe, with our European governments bluntly ignoring the will of their people in going to war, I should quote two giants of my country, Italy, to spark a glimmer of hope. One is Giuseppe Verdi, the Italian composer, and the other one is Pope John XXIII, whose encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, published on April 11, 1963, was then translated into Russian and English and was a key to the peace process between Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev in Russia, as it was recognized at a recent conference in Rome at the Abbate on the 60th anniversary of JFK's famous peace speech at the American University. In a recent statement as chairwoman of Movisol in support of the referendum in Italy to stop sending weapons to Ukraine, based on Article 11 of the Italian Constitution, I strongly denounced Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who at the G7 in Hiroshima, hand in hand with President Joe Biden, had the guts of speaking of peace while they were both preparing for war with Russia and China, including nuclear war. I was reminded of the words used by Giuseppe Verdi in his opera Don Carlos, inspired by Friedrich Schiller, in which Don Rodrigo tells King Philip of Spain that his so-called peace for the Flanders is a horrible, horrible peace, the peace of the tombs, of the graveyards. A very similar expression was used by JFK during his speech at the American University when he said that he did not want a Pax Americana, a peace of graves, but a true peace for all people and for all times. Pope John XXIII shared JFK's view. In his encyclical letter, he was very clear about the facts that building armaments may only lead to a Third World War, and only a treaty for disarmament, as the one promoted a few months later by JFK, could prevent this danger. He wrote, quote, "There is a common belief that under modern conditions, peace cannot be assured, except on the basis of an equal balance of armaments, and that this factor is the probable cause of this stockpiling of armaments. Thus, if one country increases its military strength, others are immediately roused by competitive spirit to augment their own supply of armaments. And if one country is equipped with atomic weapons, others consider themselves justified in producing such weapons themselves, equal in destructive force." The quote continues, "Consequently, people are living in a grip of constant fear. They are afraid that at any moment, the impending storm may break upon them with horrific violence. And they have good reasons for their fear, for there is certainly no lack of such weapons. While it is difficult to believe that anyone would dare to assume responsibility for initiating the appalling slaughter and destruction that war will bring in its wake, there is no denying that the conflagration could be started by some chance and unforeseen circumstance. Moreover, even though the monstrous power of modern weapons does indeed act as a deterrent, there is reason to fear that the very testing of nuclear devices for war purposes can, if continued, lead to serious dangers for various forms of life on Earth." The quote continues, "Hence, justice, right reason, and the recognition of man's dignity cry out insistently for a cessation to the arms race. The stockpiles of armaments which have been built up in various countries must be reduced all round and simultaneously by the parties concerned. Nuclear weapons must be banned. A general agreement must be reached on a suitable disarmament program with the effective system of mutual control." In the words of Pope Pius XII, quote, "The calamity of a world war with the economic and social ruin and the moral excesses and dissolution that accompany it must not on any account be permitted to engulf the human race for a third time." End of quote of Pope Pius XII. His final prayer reminds us also of the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, often quoted by Helge Zepp-LaRouche, and the concept of forgiveness. Quote, this is still the Pope, "Let us then pray with all fervor for this peace which our divine Redeemer came to bring us. May he banish from the souls of men whatever might endanger peace. May he transform all men into witnesses of truth, justice, and brotherly love. May he illumine with his light the minds of rulers, so that besides caring for the proper material welfare of their peoples, they may also guarantee them the fairest gift of peace. Finally, may Christ inflame the desires of all men to break through the barriers which divide them, to strengthen the bonds of mutual love, to learn to understand one another and to pardon those who have done them wrong. Through his power and inspiration, may all peoples welcome each other to their hearts as brothers, and may the peace they long for ever flow and ever reign among them. And Liliana finishes her message by saying, may therefore Pope John XXIII, JFK, and Giuseppe Verdi inspire all of us to fight for a true peace, which only comes from respecting and developing the rest of the world. Okay. So, now let me ask Mr. Maurizio Abbate of the Italian National Institute for Cultural Activities, attached to the Ministry of Culture of Italy, come to the podium and present his subject, which is Culture is the Key to World Peace.
Buongiorno.
Good day. Dear friends and colleagues from around the world, we're gathered here today to seek with all our strength useful ideas and solutions to resolve the terrible armed conflict that has been raging in the old continent for almost a year and a half. A fratricidal war capable of bringing death and destruction among the civilians in the territories directly involved, and very serious economic and financial crisis in the rest of the world due to a system of speculation implemented with unprecedented speculation that has been implemented by the food and energy multinationals, corporations often controlled by the same masters. We're well aware that giants such as Vanguard and BlackRock share a majority of the shares of agribusiness multinationals through Monsanto, Cargill, DuPont. And the same hold today in Ukraine, about 19 million hectares of land devoted to intensive agriculture, which corresponds to 60% of Ukrainian agricultural land. Similarly, 100% of Ukrainian mines are now owned by multinational. To ask why war broke out in this part of Europe, starting from those simple figures, therefore seems superfluous. The important thing, therefore, is not to analyze the causes of the conflict, but rather to try to understand how it was possible that the American public, as well as the European public, who were always attentive to the problem of peace, thanks to their peace movements, are today almost numbed by what is happening. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. These were the slogans engraved on the facade of the Ministry of Truth, described in George Orwell's famous novel. This year, the European Union, in an almost grotesque way, has created a peace instrument to allocate nearly 8 billion euros for the purchase of weapons. Buying weapons to prevent conflict and build peace, this is stated prominently on the European Council's website. Almost a parallel to Orwell's Ministry of Truth. If an institution such as the European Union can alter the foundations of freedoms, that is, the truth, by characterizing the supply of weapons, tools for killing, as useful tools for building peace, then the cultural and moral degradation of the institutions, as well as that of the media, that should be exposing such lies, has become self-evident. Unfortunately, what I have previously stated about the concentration of food and energy production in the hands of a few power holders is also true for other institutions, the media, and those in charge of education. Culture, which, emulating the teachings of Socrates and Plato, should be concerned with developing thoughts and indicating the models of society to be built in order to achieve nobler goals, such as general welfare and solidarity among peoples, is constantly downgraded to a kind of unimportant fashion. Such principles, at the same time, are subordinated to the interests of a few economic powers who have made contemporary society a huge market of precariousness in which everything can be sold or bought, even the right to life. A society in which social cohesion is being progressively demolished and upon which continuous alleged emergencies are being imposed, such as climate, health, and finance, capable of altering national choices in agriculture, crafts, industry, and society. Therefore, dear friends, the time has come to stop this neo-barbaric drift caused by the globalization of economy and culture. A new social and cultural renaissance must be initiated. To do so, a new paradigm is urgently needed for our Western communities, which must definitively abandon the principle of business as the centerpiece of society and put man, with his material and spiritual complexity, back in the center. Politics must redefine a harmonious system in which every man and woman has his or her own role in a synergistic and organic way. A society in which human beings must be judged and valued for who they are, for the values they express, and that succeed in embodying rather than judging them for what they possess. Only in this way can individual nations, free, independent, self-determined, and with their own specificities, become communities again and contribute to the global growth of humanity. The differences and peculiarities of peoples, generated by centuries of history and different cultures, must become the driving force to build a constructive dialogue for peaceful coexistence. A dialogue that leads to an equitable distribution of the resources of the planet on which we all live, and which are often the cause of armed clashes and unprecedented violence due to the criminal desire to concentrate them in the hands of a few. As we are developing this thesis and try to involve all those who share its aims, however, strong and pervasive signals must be sent out. It is imperative to make it clear to the world that so many free people not only have no intention of bowing to the deliberate decisions autocratically made by globalist elites, but are ready for a global change of the paradigm imposed until now by those who believe themselves to be the absolute masters. Confronted with the holders of the major global media in a now imminent head-on clash, networking is needed. It is necessary to organize as many events as possible and use every single television, computer, or radio channel to spread the news. Inviting foreign guests to local events must also become a habit, capable of disrupting the mantra that only globalization can guarantee freedom. Freedom, pluralism, and democracy. The ENAC, the National Institute for Cultural Activities in Italy, which I am proud to represent, is organizing a conference in Italy with the aim of re-establishing relations between Syria and Italy. Economic and cultural relations that were interrupted for mere political interest and have not been reopened, even in the aftermath of the dramatic earthquake that caused thousands of civilian casualties in Turkey and Syria. At this conference, in which we would be happy to welcome any of those present today who would like to participate, we intend to send a clear and unequivocal message. While liberalism talks about peace and democracy causing wars and building walls, we respond with the strength of culture, the only one capable of guaranteeing and respecting individual differences while working on building a bridge made of friendship, solidarity, and cooperation among peoples. Thank you all.
So thank you for these wise words and these calls for actions. Now I have the pleasure and the honor to call to the podium Madame Tatjana Zdanoka. She's a member of the European Parliament for Latvia. And she will tell her story on what's happening with culture, and especially Russian culture, in Europe. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, of course, thanks to organizers and thanks for inviting me in this excellent event and possibility to speak on very, very painful problem. But few words about the topic of this panel in general. So, we used to say, don't bring me, my God, to live during an era of big changes. But we are living during an era of big changes now. The methods of management focused on unifying the population of Europe and the world according to values of Homo economicus, the self-sufficient rational consumer, are enduring a systemic crisis. The economic person is not even an abstraction. It is a reduction, a flat projection of one of a set of measurements of any human being. The reality is that all people, West Europeans, East Europeans, the Chinese, Indians, Russians cannot be reduced to the sum of their economic requirements and to functioning as consumers of goods and the benefits. Each person exists only in the interrelations and the relations with other people, and these communications are irreducible to mutually advantageous or mutually acceptable economic exchange. These are social and political communications belonging to language, culture, national or subnational community, or to religious community. Both these communications and interests are unrealizable out of community, out of political space. The following phenomenon is evident. With the growth of integration, on the contrary, awareness of the originality increases. These are known, this is a known mathematical rule. I am a mathematician by profession. The process of integration must be accompanied by the process of differentiation. I'm often using in the European Parliament, where there is a big hall dedicated to famous musician Yegudi Minuhin, and I had the opportunity to participate in his activities as creator of special fund for cultures of European minorities. And his words just during one of the events were as follows: either Europe will be the Europe of cultures, or Europe will die. The title of my intervention is on demonization of Russian culture, being one of cultures of Europe. There is no need to argue that the EU is infected with Russophobia. Here is just one single example out of thousands, if technicians will show the first slide, please. Yeah. You can see is this slide the invitation to the discussion entitled Pushing Pushkin, the imperialism and decolonization of Russian culture. It was, this event took place in March this year, co-hosted by two MEPs, one Lithuanian from EPP group, European People's Party, and one French MEP from Renew, from presidential party, Raphael Glucksmann, with two guest speakers, Edward Lucas from Britain and Kristina Zabalauskas from Lithuania. So the main idea promoted by the organizers and guests of the discussion is that Russia has always used and continues to use any work of culture as a weapon of colonization. And therefore, the policy of exclusion for Russian culture must be carried out. In my state, Latvia, as well as in all three Baltic states, this burning hatred to everything Russian is irrational and caused by a complex of state inferiority of national elites. It's my opinion, of course. At this moment, the Russian minority of Latvia is on the verge of catastrophe, under the blows of the decisions taken by the ruling politicians who represent exclusively the national majority. Since last spring, the situation has deteriorated significantly. The war in Ukraine served as a signal for new persecution of the Russian speakers of Latvia. If 4 years ago my colleague Inese Vaidere, a member of the European Parliament from Latvia, denounced me to the State Security Service for publicly stating that Russians in Latvia felt like Jews on the way of World War II in our country. She told that we cannot compare the situation of Jews in Germany with the situation of Russian speakers. Nowadays, another colleague, Sandra Kalniete, calmly tweets that, in brackets, we should take advantage of the window of opportunity that has opened to solve issues important to our people. That is, first of all, elimination of education in Russian and the demolition of the monuments to the liberators of Latvia from the Nazi invaders. For you to know, ethnic Russians make up 25% of the population of Latvia, but the Russian-speaking linguistic minority makes up to 37% of the country's population. This part of PAC country's population is mixed in origin. Some represent the descendants of the citizens of the Republic of Latvia, which existed between two world wars, and some represent the labor migrants of the Soviet era. Among voters, there are about 25% of Russian-speaking citizens, since 12% of the whole country's populations are in possession of so-called aliens passports and are not eligible to vote. When speaking about window of opportunity, the Latvian colleague just underlined that we can now achieve our goals without much international attention. Therefore, I guess international attention is needed to the problem. So the goals she spoke about are to suppress and marginalize the country's Russian-speaking population. Latvian society is sinking in the wave of hate speech in the mainstream media and social networks. Columnists and commentators openly compare Russian-speaking compatriots with animals, fifth column, aggressive occupiers. One of the members of national parliament of the ruling coalition openly called for ethnic cleansing, aiming at increasing the proportion of ethnic Latvians in the country's population. The signatures are collected on a petition for the expulsion of disloyal citizens from the country, I am among them, and deprivation of their Latvian citizenship, as well as on a petition for a ban of my party, Latvian-Russian Union, standing for the protection of the rights of Russian-speaking minority. The European Union nominally has an instrument to combat this kind of manifestation. This is a Council framework decision as of 2008 on combating certain forms and expressions of racism. This document does not have direct effect. It obliges the states to criminalize the respective acts in their legislation. And the Latvian Criminal Code has an article punishing incitement to national, ethnic, and racial hatred. The crux of the matter is that this article is only selectively applied in my country. Appeals to the police and state security bosses regarding the use of hate speech and calls for violence against Russian-speaking residents of Latvia are completely fruitless. Consistent refusals to initiate criminal proceedings are coming in. At the same time, charges of allegedly inciting hatred against the titular population have been brought against several journalists writing in Russian, the most prominent of them being Yuri Alexeyev and Vladimir Linderman. The government has prepared a package of initiatives to destroy memorials dedicated to the soldiers of the Soviet Army who liberated Latvia from Nazi occupation during World War I. About 150,000 Soviet soldiers died in the battles for the liberation of Latvia. In almost every family, of Russian-speaking Latvians, and in many Latvian families, the memory of the victims of the war and the ancestors who fought on the side of anti-Hitler coalition is preserved. Through this initiative, demolition of monuments, people are deprived of the opportunity to preserve their memory, their historic memory, the memory of their families. Thanks to the efforts of our party, complaints were submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and the temporary settlement was requested, so a ban of the demolition of 8 monuments until the complaints were finalized. All these requests were granted by the committee. However, the government ignored this decision, stating that it was only advisory in nature. During last summer and autumn, more than 70 monuments to the liberators of Latvia from German fascist occupiers were dismantled. I was among those who addressed the committee. Fate so decreed that the land on which one of the monuments stood belonged to my ancestors, victims of the Holocaust, Jewish family killed during Nazi occupiers. Please show the slide. Yeah. This is a monument in the city of Vereycken, eastern part of Latvia, former Vitebsk gubernia. Many people know Vitebsk by Mark Chagall. My grandmother was studying in St. Petersburg University together with Mark Chagall, and she then lived in Russia and remained alive, only one of the whole family, being in Latvia and being persecuted as Jews. So in addition to the demolition of the World War II monuments, maybe please go ahead. Yeah, this was demolition of Alyosha. Yeah. Also, other monuments became victims. This one is in Riga, in our capital, in the park, Pushkin Monument. Yeah, created by one sculptor living in the Netherlands, in Maastricht, of Russian origin, Taratinov, Alexander Taratinov. And this monument was recently dismantled. You see, before dismantling, there were actions like this, and then dismantled. So the fight against monuments of the past continues with repressions against people living in Latvia today. Some of the elderly people are under risk to become illegals. The new retroactive norm provides annulation in the case of bad knowledge of Latvian language, the permanent residence permission for those who acquired the citizenship of Russia. But most grave consequences of the use of this window of opportunities affect the young generation. The ongoing destruction of minority education has started in 1995 for higher education, then continued in 2004 for secondary education, and 2018 primary education. But the latest amendments to the education law, just using this window of opportunities after events of January 22, deemed to abolish the education in Russian language and other minority languages. We have few Polish schools and one Belarusian, one Ukrainian in total. And it will apply even for private schools, not only public. I will conclude my intervention with a fragment of the video clip produced by our team in 2003, 20 years ago, when the mass protests of Russian speakers against education reform has started. with the kind permission of Roger Waters, the fragments of the famous Pink Floyd clip, The Wall, were used. You can see this fragment of the video. So we continue to fight, and we believe that the wall of prohibition of minority education in Europe will finally be finished, because we are true standing for the rights of cultures, and one of them is just our right of Russian speakers to have education in our native language. Thank you.
Thank you. So now the final speaker for this panel, before we can have a couple of questions from the room, is Madame Lise Augustat, President of the International Association Peace by Culture Europe, a world peace based on the common ethical values.
I need it a little bit. Yeah? Is it okay like this?
Okay.
Okay.
Not far away.
Okay, yes. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Peace Through Culture is an organization whose main target is to build bridges between ethnics, countries, religions, traditions, and different worldviews. Focused on our function as an inspirer and connector, we organized numerous conferences in Kazakhstan and other Eurasian countries. Looking back to our World Congress towards Spiritual Concord in Alma-Ata with more than 1,500 attendees, which was supported greatly by the then President Nursultan Nazarbayev, I especially remember the late Professor Dr. Hans-Peter Dürr, the world-renowned German quantum physicist, director of the famous Max Planck Institute for Physics, and winner of the Alternative Nobel Prize, who so often enriched us with his participation and insights. Our joint conversations are partially reflected in my contribution. Nuclear physicists are eagerly following the basic question on what is holding our world together at its core. So Professor Dürr also asked himself what actually is behind matter. He split matter into smaller and smaller parts, hoping to eventually find the essence. But after 50 years of research, he came to the astonishing conclusion: the essence does not lie in matter, but actually does not even exist in the way we thought. What we think matter is, actually is vibration and energy. It is a structure of relations. Reality is quite different from what we have imagined it to be so far. Expressed in modern language, there is no physical matter hardware at the beginning, but idea and software. In other words, and with the help of logics, it follows that the so-called physical or gross matter and the so-called subtle matter are two sides of the same coin, an inseparable unity of spirit and matter. This statement, so far assigned to the area of spirituality, is now getting substantiated scientifically by quantum physics step by step, and is likely to radiate into all areas of society in the future. Our world is the one and the whole and cannot be dissected. This fact leads to fantastic consequences, because if we include ourselves in this world, we are distinguishable but not separate. We are all part of this community, within this connectedness. In Sanskrit, they call it Advaita, the oneness, the a-duality. When people wage wars against each other, they are hurting themselves at the same time, because all living parts are part of the one. When anything in the world suffers, we suffer with it, even if we do not know the reason. And this is not to be attributed to sentimentality, but it's a deep ontological feeling that touches our common roots. Despite retaining our individuality, we are part of a higher unity, the whole of humanity. Reality around us is constantly giving evidence to the collective liability mankind is caught in. Let us just take examples such as the El Niño, or the testing of nuclear weapons, or the gigantic emissions of poison by the industry into the air and the oceans. Effects that do not stop at national borders, nor at the heights of the mountains, nor at the depths of the oceans. Worldwide cooperation, individual ethical responsibility, benevolence and mutual understanding of cultures and traditions among people will be necessary to climb the next step towards world peace. So far, unfortunately, the United Nations have fulfilled the hope of uniting the world through joint political action just rudimentarily in some individual departments. Can we create something similar in the field of international, intercultural, and interreligious understanding and achieve effective results? Many years ago, my late father, Willi Augustat, already introduced the concept of an international World Ethics Congress, from which a World Ethical Council subsequently would have to emerge. Such an institution would ensure that universal ethical requirements and corresponding parameters could optimally be considered in all major decisions at all levels. It is true that not all languages differentiate between the terms ethics and moral. However, we can clearly state that moral is a somewhat limited term used within society of either local or temporary significance, what to do or not to do in the sense of customs and traditions. What was allowed and accepted in former times is now no longer valid, and vice versa. The current morals are part of education and legal regulations within a country or group, whereas the ethical foundation is already part of the human being. It is, so to say, inborn in the individual. Looking for universal peace principles, we find them in all great world religions, which have a lot of basic ethical requirements as a common denominator for the individual's consciousness and character. Ethical councils on a worldwide basis could be composed of impartial representatives of the academies of the humanities and social scientists, artists, scientists in general, and religious representatives. They would have to recognize all world religions in their original sense and represent ethics as the common foundation of all cultures and religions. Each candidate would have to be chosen by virtue of his knowledge and authority in a particular field, and by virtue of the esteem and trust he enjoys by his own or related cultures. In this conceptual framework, national ethical councils would have to send representatives to the World Ethical Councils, which needs to be definitely on a par with the United Nations. All measures would only be adopted with the agreement of both bodies, so that ethical standards are taken into account in every political and other far-reaching decision. Veto rights would not exist within the countries of the United Nations as they do today, but only on the part of the Ethical Council. In a future work community, the advantage of one must be also the advantage of all others. All cultures of the world should be allowed to keep their substance and thus be included in the aspired overarching world peace culture. Unity in diversity, universal ethical principles such as justice, non-violence, equality, freedom, community, or philanthropy are the values of today. The kickoff could take place in the frame of an ethical congress where the participants define their guidelines and elect suitable candidates. Let us carry this idea to the next level of practical realization together, and maybe it can be even linked with Helga's idea regarding the Pope as an appropriate candidate for such a gremium. We are here today because we know that there is no other way left for us but to move forward towards peace, if life on earth is to continue. We all are aware that time is mature for a new paradigm and a profound change of consciousness. Going back to Plato and other philosophers, we must awaken our consciousness again to the cosmic law of cause and effect, which at the same time is connected to self-responsibility for everyone. Fritjof Capra, physicist and futurologist, compares this approach with the global immune system that becomes active for protection of our Earth, a collective and almost instinctive response of humanity to the acute threat of livelihood. This immune system consists of many people and groups who are tirelessly engaged in all places of our globe to neutralize and regenerate the harmful influences that are threatening our life everywhere. I'm very happy that the Schiller Institute offers a strong network of such an immune reaction for a peaceful future for all. And let me close with my father's words: world peace can only build on a higher cultural consciousness and responsibility, as well as awareness of necessary action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I call to the podium Helga Zeppler-Rouch, the founder of the Schiller Institute, to ask her to comment on the interventions. Thank you.
Well, let me say, what a breath of fresh air to have truly intellectuals who express a sense of humanity take the word. And I think these ideas, all of them were, from Mrs. Zdanoka to Mr. Abbate to Professor Reychler to Ms. Augustat. I think all these ideas are very constructive, and I think they give you a sense of why Nicolaus of Cusa, for example, was absolutely right when he said the only reason why people from different races, different nations, different cultures can communicate with each other is because they are artists, they are scientists, they are philosophers, they are people of ideas. And I think that is exactly, what we have to counter this war culture. I think that if we look at Europe right now, I fully agree with the quote you mentioned from Menuhin. You know, Europe will be either the Europe of culture or we will not exist. I mean, we are right now, as Europeans, in such an existential crisis that if I find it absolutely flabbergasting how few people are aware of that. I mean, we as a continent are being dismissed. Our allies are bombing our infrastructure, the Nord Stream pipeline. We are exposed to, basically a deindustrialization, which will mean Europe will, what we saw in France in the last weeks, will be a foretaste of what will happen in all of our countries if we do not reverse course, because social chaos will erupt when the basis of material existence collapses. And I think that this conference comes at an extremely important time because, on the one side, the danger is absolutely incredible. I think, the enemy makes mistakes. The fact that the United States now decided to deliver cluster bombs to Ukraine, I think is a big mistake on their part because it will get even the most stupid greenies upset. Even Baerbock had to distance herself from that, which is a major sign of cracking in the system. So I think that, we are right now in a period where I think the next year, maybe 2 years, maybe 1.5 years, but not more, I absolutely think that because of a variety of processes, the blowout of the financial system, the exhaust factor of the Ukrainian population, the massive momentum of the global south being absolutely determined to create a new system. And, if you look at what President Ramaphosa said, build us this Inga dam and then we will believe you. And if you don't do it, you are finished. We don't trust you anymore. So I think that this determination to build a new system, together with a lot of other factors, puts us in a time window, because history is not like a soap opera. It's not like, every day a new part and it goes on forever. But if you look back in history, you always have branching points after which it was too late. World War I, World War II. And, we are right now in one of these periods, where we are breaking through the barrier, the Mach 1 to Mach 2, or however you want to compare it. And I think we have to really go out of this conference with the solemn commitment that we will organize this beautiful European continent, who I think, Germany and France and Italy and other countries, we contributed a lot to the science and technological development. We produced a lot of scientists, inventors in the past. But if you look at it, what will be of lasting value, what we can contribute as European nations to the new paradigm, which must come into being in the short term, I really think it is possible in the short term, will be our culture. I think it would be absolutely regrettable if a new paradigm comes into being with Africa, Latin America, Asia, whatever other countries want to join, and Europe would descend into chaos, where we just, are sidelined. We are in a fossil in the museum in Mongolia as a culture which didn't make it, which is much closer than people think. But what would be lost, is the unique cultural contribution of the Italian Renaissance, of the French idea of the Polytechnique, of the German classical music, and many other Renaissance phenomena. And I think, as unlikely it is, because I have not heard one of these European politicians ever speak about the substance of Plato, the substance of Cusa, the substance of Leibniz. They have a nominal agreement to the Ninth Symphony, but what does it mean for them? All men become brethren, they are doing the opposite. They're causing blocks. So I think we have to go out of this conference with a solemn commitment that we will revive the beautiful European culture, because I believe it is much more tuned to the human nature, the human soul. Human beings are beautiful. Power of creativity is stronger than the power of hatred. So I would like, people to join the discussion that we really go out of this conference with an explosion of optimism that we will be, hegemonic in our philosophy and not the enemy.
Okay, we have before concluding with a poem and a very short musical intervention, we have time for a couple of questions. So, Terris, go ahead. Mr. Mishra.
Hello. My name is Karel Gillesberg. I work with the Schiller Institute in Denmark. And I'm actually from Kosovo, as we say. I would just like to say some words because, when NATO intervened in Kosovo in 1999, I said this is a just war with an unjust cause. Because, there was a period of 10 years in Kosovo where the Serbian regime did what the Ukrainian regime did against the Russians in southern Ukraine. They closed schools down. They actually treated people as subhumans. And this degrading a population as subhumans is like giving wings to hate. And this is the biggest problem right now we see everywhere. They give hate wings because they say, but the Russians are not human beings. I compare the Serbian regime with the Ukrainian regime very consciously because in the Balkans everybody knew what was going on. In Kosovo, it was genocide, but there was 20 years of a racist regime. So, there's something going on in Ukraine. They treat the Russians as subhumans, but how can we, in these times, get people to understand that, when you degrade human beings to something else, racism is not just against black and Chinese, but it's against other nationalities. So we have to make sure that through the dialogue of culture concerts, which I hope everybody who is in this panel will help the Schiller Institute to organize dialogue of cultures everywhere, because hate is what is the problem, the hate against a nationality, the hate of people. Because this is what I see that in the 30s, how could Nazism be possible? Hate. So maybe you can address this.
Okay. I propose we take other questions and then we will give opportunity for all speakers to answer on the questions raised. So, Mr. Mishra, so please try to make more questions to the words spoken and the ideas developed on the panel.
Thank you all for fantastic speeches. I am a little extra fascinated by Liz Augusta's speech because she quoted Sanskrit Advaita principle. And one concrete question to you is if in any way I can borrow that speech and read it a little more. And one small question to you, which is so fantastic, that how can we create a way of living that one person's advantage is everyone's advantage? Something of that sort you mentioned in your speech. Like, I see that one of the dilemmas when I moved from India to here is
that this competition, you have Tour de France, so one gets 25 seconds ahead, it's a disadvantage for the other. But I'm thinking about a culture, creating a culture where one's advantage is everyone's advantage, a great spiritual principle. How do we do that? That's a question to you. Thank you.
I want other questions. Other questions? Can you speak in the microphone?
Yeah, to Mrs. Zdanoka. First, I would like to say my full appreciation to the Russian community in Latvia, because I know some Russians which have experienced exactly as you said. And you mentioned that you had already a complaint at the UN. And I'm asking myself, what for is the UN nowadays good? What for? There are laws. You said you contributed this unlawful government, in that sense, how they treat Russian people. If the law already on the world basis exists, what is the UN good for if the government is treating the people like no law is there? I mean, what for? And there are so many other things to tell in the same sense. And to that lady, which you mentioned something from Kosovo, I'm native. I could also. You are an Albanian, okay? So I'm a Serbian, and I could say exactly the opposite thing. Exactly the opposite thing. And this is a dilemma, definitely. They are faked, as you, like Bucha, there were killed people, okay, in the war. They were killed, Albanians, okay? And a Finnish scientist actually was the one who looked at those bodies, and there is a proof that they were killed in the war. And she told this to the UN guy, hey, this is not true, this wasn't actually literally done, but you sold it as it was literally done. And there were even Albanians, okay, who admitted nowadays that that was a fake. And I would like for you to consider that that was a fake, and that's a lot of untruth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We take one other question, and then the speakers are going to answer.
Thank you, all the panelists. I'm journalist of People's Daily from China. This morning we've talked about culture. We all know that at the core of culture there are values, the concept of values. We know nowadays the US always give this narrative in which it is the leading defender of so-called universal values, and including democracy, freedom, human rights, etc. And it casts China as the biggest rival to these values, and it wants to convince its Western allies and other countries of it. And I think many people here may think it's wrong, toxic, and dangerous, because it will put our world at the risk of new Cold War. So my question is, maybe this question go for Mr. Reychler or other panelists. My question is, what's the fundamental mistake under this narrative, and how can we break and go beyond this narrative, especially when we are still living in a world where U.S. propaganda, U.S. voice is still dominant? Thank you.
Thanks. So I just want to add a personal question to Professor Reychler, which he can also answer, is what he developed in one of his books on the importance of empathy as a major factor to be really taken into the minds of everybody, to be able to involve in a peace process. So the speakers are going to answer in the order of their interventions.
Oh.
No, you started. Because...
Okay, sorry. No, the first thing I would like to address is the comment on hate. Hate is really at the bottom of escalation and escalation of wars. Yes, I would fully agree, and this relates a lot to empathy, or basically the lack of empathy. When I look at the war in Ukraine, and also then the conflicts in the Baltic states, the empathy has not developed. The situation is disastrous in terms of empathy because it led to escalation of war. It led to the conviction that, for example, sanctions are the way to peace, which is really bullshit, because if you really are a psychologist and you have studied behaviorism, you have Skinner, you would know that it's not by sanctions that you get peace. It's really by mutual benefit, by reward system. And of course, one of the consequences of the lack of empathy is this exclusive nationalism. And we had an example from Tatjana, we had an example in Ukraine, and it's a big problem. And as a Belgian, like this. As a Belgian, I'm even more sensitive to it. We are a small country, but we have 3 official languages: French, Flemish, and German. The education is organized by the main language communities, Flemish and Walloon. So we find this very strange that it's not possible, at least to entertain the alternative, instead of creating some kind of exclusive nationalism that you've seen in Ukraine, but also in the Baltic states. A last thing about Belgium, when I ask my students, how do you find yourself politically? They would have multiple loyalties. And in our country, this is very normal. They would say, well, I'm from Antwerp, I'm a Fleming, I'm a Belgian and European. And some, of course, will go higher. But so the whole problem is really related to empathy. Of course, I will not talk further of it, because empathy it's one of the most important things in sustainable peace building. It's not only about diplomacy, it's about structures, but also this political psychology, empathy. And empathy is important for trust, and without trust, forget it.
Thank you. Answer some of the. Do you want to say something to the questions raised? You should translate into English.
Facciamo consecutivo.
Dunque, quando si parla di guerre, bisogna ripensare a quello che è avvenuto nel corso della storia.
When we talk about wars, we must look at what happened during the course of history.
Le guerre si sono sempre combattuti annunciando grandi principi.
They fought wars always starting with announcing great principles.
Ma nella guerra ci sono 2 parti in causa. Chi la guerra la vuole per interessi e chi la subisce.
But in war there are always 2 parties. The one that wants war for its interests, and the party that is victim of the war.
Le guerre moderne non hanno nulla di differente rispetto al passato. Ieri si combatteva per la religione, si facevano guerre per il territorio, oggi si fanno le guerre per la concentrazione e il dominio geopolitico.
So wars have not changed. Yesterday they made war for religion, religious wars, and today they make war for the concentration of power, for geopolitics.
Se la guerra in Jugoslavia, in Kosovo, è stato un segnale forte di come il mondo unipolare poteva decidere quali fossero i nemici da colpire,
if the war in Kosovo was a demonstration on how the unipolar world was able to single out countries to be hit,
quelle successive, come adesso quella che stiamo vivendo in Ucraina, intende staccare definitivamente l'unione che si era creata tra la Russia e l'Europa.
Wars like the one we are seeing now in Ukraine are aimed at ultimately split Russia from Europe.
Noi in questi giorni abbiamo discusso di grandi principi, adesso però dobbiamo lavorare per renderli realizzabili. Grazie.
These days we talked about great principles, now we must work to make them, to implement them. Thank you.
Yes. There was one common question and one addressed to me particularly, but I like to try to join them both. So, about United Nations and the approach, I used to repeat, although it seems very simply, but I used to repeat often one of the first articles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You remember that it appeared after the Second World War in 1948, and it is told that any human being born equal and free in their conscience and rights. And here is the border, whether we just see things that people are equal or that mankind is divided by categories. Yeah, one superior than others. That's what is nowadays the main point of division of ideologies. Yeah, we speak about nationalism, culture. We cannot avoid these feelings of native cultures, knowing poesy, knowing literature, etc., etc. But we do not need to think that our culture is better than the others one. That is the problem, and people are different. Big friend of mine, Fernand de Varenne, United Nations Commissioner for Minorities, recently speaking, he told that this idea that someone is superior than the others are appearing before in people's minds, and only then concentration camps and gas cameras appear, not otherwise. Brzezinski told that only ideology which can come after communism may be nationalism, and we have to use it. And it was used in Ukraine. But we have to remind that Zelensky's pre-election promises were just peace and respect for Russian speakers, respect for minorities. He himself is a native Russian speaker. But all this was then neglected and forgotten. So the question was whether we do believe to United Nations and their decisions. Yes, I do still. Also, my big friend, British lawyer specialist on European law here, working here also as a barrister in Strasbourg, he says he published a book, Degradation of the International Legal Order. and he just refers to the Yugoslavia, wars in Yugoslavia, starting point of this degradation. In his title there is a question sign, but so we have to find the answer, whether there is degradation of the international order or not. We still believe that we can somehow use this international legal order just to realize this idea that all human beings are equal in their dignity and rights.
A very difficult question, yes, how to solve this. I think at the moment it's very important that we get the science into the boat, because there are some people who are linked to some religious traditions, spiritual traditions. So for them it's a different idea to cooperate and to help each other. But there are a lot of people, especially in Europe, who are not linked anymore into religious traditions or spiritual traditions. And I think the only way to get them into the boat is science. And there I count on one hand on quantum physics, but also on the latest research, for example, on placebo effects, placebo, or what is the English word for this, where what you put before into some fancy universe, they show that your personal attitude and also the attitude of your doctor giving you some medicine has at least a 50% effect on the outcome. And this is now away from thinking. It's in scientific researches on several universities, because, for example, it has also the effect that you can reduce the substances in the pills by 50 to 70%, because if you know as a patient that the pill, I don't know, with the red stripes helps you against blood pressure and you have internalized it, the scientific studies have shown that you can reduce 2/3 of the pills, take away the substance, because it just helps because of your attitude. And I think this is very important now, to link together this subtle matter, the mind, the spirit, and the hardware. This is where a lot of intellectually focused people are. And this is what I feel very often in discussions. And if we see that science proves things like being connected, it goes away from being nice, because some people just, why should they be nice? But if it's not a question of being nice, but of surviving yourself, because we are all connected, and of self-protection, I think this attitude will change the world.
Well, I think that the center of the change will be love, because the opposite of hatred is love. And I think that's something we can all start to apply right away. Confucius and also Lessing said you can start to love at will, momentarily. You can decide, you change your emotion into love, and you can do it. And you can try it at home when you start to, when you fight with somebody, you hate this person or you're angry, and then you do something positive for that person, for the mind of that person, and you will immediately see that your emotion changes. It's the loving attitude of a father, of a mother to the children. And that you have to expand, you have to apply it to larger groups, to humanity as a whole. And I'm actually very optimistic, because the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, are vibrant in people who are opposing this present situation. And I think we all can learn enormous lessons from the idea of nonviolence, of direct action, of having the courage to stand up for what is right, but denouncing violence. And I want to also suggest that you all read Friedrich Schiller, especially the aesthetic letters, because, the aesthetic education is how you get yourself improved. They call now China and other countries dictatorships and autocracies. Why? Because the government is demanding that the people become better, that they become more noble, that they eliminate certain vices, like China has forbidden pop music because it portrays a degraded image of women. I fully agree. I think rap music is portraying a degraded image of women, and therefore we should not have it. If you say this in France or in Germany, you are being called an autocrat, a fascist, and that shows you how wrong it is. But Schiller had this idea of the aesthetic education, that through art, through classical music, great painting, poetry, that you evoke something more noble in the soul of the person. And the more you do that, and the shorter the intervals become where you don't do it, the more you improve. And I think this idea of lifelong self-improvement, of trying to become a better person, is an absolute essential part of what we are trying to do. Because if you don't change, how can you expect the world to change? So the aesthetic education, which was also what influenced the emergence of China, the modern China, very much, because the first education minister of the new Republic of China, Tsai Yuanpei, I always pronounce it wrongly, but he studied from Schiller, from Humboldt, and he started to say that the aesthetic education, how Schiller developed it, was the most advanced, and he introduced it into the Chinese education system. And President Xi Jinping many times praised and emphasized the aesthetic education as that which makes people develop a beautiful mind. And the beautiful mind is what creates the sciences, the arts. So that is what we also have to absolutely include in this. And then we have to have a dialogue of civilizations and cultures, because the only reason why hate and prejudice and so forth can dominate is because people don't know anything about the other culture. Once you start to study them, go there, go to China, go to India, go to Russia, travel the old Silk Road, do all the things which, the great travelers of the past did. And you will discover entire universes will open up. When you see, for example, the beauty of Chinese poetry, of Chinese painting, of Chinese philosophy, your heart will open. And I think we have to commit ourselves, and that is one of the founding principles of the Schiller Institute from the very beginning, to make sure that we know these other cultures and that we have a dialogue among the best traditions of all of them. And that way we create the basis for a new renaissance for the future. So I want to invite you also all to help to build the International Peace Coalition. This is an effort which the Schiller Institute started about 6 weeks ago, and it is the effort to connect all the peace movements worldwide. We are making big progress because, it is a need of the time. And many times you can have good ideas, and for decades you are like the shouter in the desert, and nobody listens. But then comes the historical moment where the moment is ripe for this idea. And I think the moment is ripe to have world citizens of all countries unite and create this one humanity which does really correspond to what human beings should be. We are supposed to be the creative species. We are not supposed to be little boys who kick each other at the knee when you are 4 years old, but we are supposed to grow up. We are supposed to talk to each other like Schiller and Humboldt or Einstein and Planck, discussing ideas, discussing the beauty of the universe, about to discover things we have not even an inkling of how to ask the questions. So we have to raise the level of people to become truly human. And I think that is what this conference, and hopefully I agree with Mr. Abbate, have as many events as possible to discuss these ideas and become a mass movement of beauty and creativity.
Okay. Now, before we go into the lunch break, we have still two very small contributions. exactly what we need to have the right emotions, which is poetry and music. So, Alexander Hartmann, go ahead.
Yeah, I bring greetings to this conference from two people from the same family who were both in a very practical way involved in the dialogue of civilizations. The first part of the message comes from Professor Wolf Dietrich Rückert. He's a German chemical engineer, by now quite old, who was involved in the early industrialization efforts in China under Mao and Deng Xiaoping. He built chemical factories in China. So he sends the following greetings to the conference. Peace can only be achieved if people talk to each other and appreciate each other. Europe without Russia does not exist. Since we have not properly processed the Second World War, nor drawn the right conclusions, we are in this hopeless dilemma. Peace arises from mutual respect, regardless of political or religious views. I wish this conference that their thoughts are heard and implemented. Your Wolf Dietrich Rückert. Now, Professor Rückert is a descendant of Friedrich Rückert, the German 19th century poet, linguist, and translator who studied 56 languages and is one of the founders of Oriental Studies in Germany. And he is famous for translating many poems from other languages and cultures, especially Oriental cultures, into Germany. So that's taking the dialogue of culture to the highest level that I can think of. And he wrote also many, many poems by himself. Many of that were put into music, for example, Du bist die Ruhe by Franz Schubert, or Die Kindertotenlieder set by Gustav Mahler. Now let's hear what Friedrich Rückert has to tell us on the issue of peace. I will read that poem in the German original. Die Welt ist schön. Die Welt ist schön. Die Welt ist gut, gesehen als Ganzes der Schöpfung Frühlingspracht, das Heer des Sternentanzes. Die Welt ist schön, ist gut, gesehen im einzelnst Kleinen. Ein jedes Tröpfchen Tau kann Gottes Spiegel scheinen. Nur wo du Einzelnes auf Einzelnes beziehst, oh, wie vor lauter Streit du nicht den Frieden siehst. Der Frieden ist im Kreis, im Mittelpunkt ist er, drum ist er überall. Doch ihn zu sehen ist schwer. Es ist die Eintracht, die sich aus der Zwietracht baut, wo mancher vom Gerücht verwirrt den Plan nicht schaut. Drum denke, was dich stört, dass dich ein Schein betört und was du nicht begreifst, gewiss zum Plan gehört. Such erst in dir den Streit zum Frieden auszugleichen, versöhnend dann, soweit du kannst, umherzureichen. Und wo die Kraft nicht reicht, da halte dich ans Ganze. Im ewigen Liebesbund steht mit dir Stern und Pflanze. Vielen Dank.
So now we will make you a very short musical contribution. We actually would like you to experience what it is to sing a polyphony. That means that the question is, how do you create unity among different voices, different melodies? Actually, now we'll use something called a canon to do it. And the idea is, how do you create a harmonious whole without erasing individual sovereignty? So we will sing Dona Nobis Pacem. It's a canon. It is supposed to, it's Mozart who composed it. We are not sure. And it means give us peace. And so you will have 3 groups of singers there, in the middle and there. And so please don't hesitate to sing along if you want to try. And so let's do the music.